Hello, welcome to Parsha class. Good to see you all. Hope you're feeling free, or at least almost free, as we head towards Passover. And all of our learning this week is dedicated to Passover prep, not Passover prep in the house, Passover prep in the mind, in the heart, in the consciousness. And we've been doing classes all week that have been touching on Passover themes. But what is to be done here in our Parsha? What are we going to do to prepare for Passover when we have to also turn and read Parshat Tzav? Now, Parshat Tzav is, Rabbi Tzadok and I have a joke where we like circle around but don't quite say that Parshat Tzav is our least favorite parsha, because you don't want to speak ill of the Torah. You don't want to say any parsha is bad, but Parshat Tzav, it's a doozy. I mean, it's like, look, we're in Leviticus anyway, right? Like that, we've started Leviticus, and Leviticus is hard reading. We talked about that last week, and in fact, I suggested that the difficulty of reading Leviticus produces some beautiful readings as people really try to find meaning in it. But Tzav almost tests our patience in that regard, because Parshat Tzav, the second reading of Leviticus, it's not just Leviticus, it's basically a repetition of Parshat Vayikra, the first Parsha of Leviticus. First Parsha of Leviticus gave us an overview of the sacrifices, what the sacrifices are. And that already is like technical and gory and full of recipes and substances and animals. But Parshat Tzav then, as if turning to the priests, just says the same thing all over again, but gives the priests the specific instructions that they will need to bring those sacrifices. So it's like a little modification, but mostly just repetition of what we've already seen. And it's a very difficult, if this is your bar bat mitzvah parsha, you're gonna have to do some work. This is not that you didn't get you got the short straw, right? So what can be done with Tzav in general, and then what can be done with such a parsha when we are really on the heels of the greatest moment in our calendar year, right? Like I can't bore you with sacrificial particulars when you're getting ready to be liberated, to be free. Okay, so we have a problem, and we'll see what we can do. Let's say a blessing, just to gather ourselves together, gather our consciousness together, bring some holiness into our learning. Blessing ends la'asok b'divrei Torah, to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so here's what we're going to do today. We're going to participate in an ancient tradition, but it's not a tradition that's codified. It's just a tradition you all know about. And the tradition is like this. We read through the Torah, and every week there's a parsha, but when there's a holiday coming up, it is the rabbinic way. It is the Jewish way. It is you can't help yourself, but to somehow try and link whatever you're saying about the parsha to the upcoming holiday. Okay, so around Hanukkah, we are reading the story of Joseph, and so you'll hear all of these kind of rabbinic attempts to explain how Joseph is actually a very Hanukkah-like figure. And he is. It actually works pretty well. I mean, this whole idea that we ought to link the Parsha to the upcoming holiday, it isn't just a kind of a party trick. It is really actually based on some sort of theological assumption that our movement through time is not random, and that every occurrence of day and week and festival and month, that they're all happening in their right time, and we are left to understand the greater significance of how they all fit together. So when you hear your rabbi friends try to tell you that Joseph is the sort of proto-Hanukkah figure, because after all, right, he was down in Egypt and having to negotiate his Jewish identity and trying to figure out whether to reveal it or not, right? Well, when you hear that kind of Torah, you're hearing a Torah that is not just a kind of a cool trick of looping together everything that's coming up and checking all your boxes. You're hearing a kind of assertion that all of the rhythms of our cycle, our Jewish cycling through time, are meaningful, and all the intersections of those cycles have even greater meaning, right? Okay, so you're going to hear about Hanukkah you're going to hear about Joseph around Hanukkah. You're going to hear around Purim, right? We'll talk a lot about the priestly garments because we're reading Parsha Tetzaveh usually around Purim. The problem is Passover, because Passover comes right when we've entered into the book of Leviticus, and it's as if Leviticus almost like seems to have forgotten that the greatest story I've ever told was just behind it. Leviticus is like, oh yeah, whatever. Can we talk more about what goes on inside the temple? All right? Can we get into more details about the sacrifices? So it's going to be really hard to link Leviticus with Passover, isn't it? And then, Parsha Tzav, most boring Parsha in the Torah. I didn't say it. But if it were the most boring Parsha in the Torah, then we're really stuck. Like, we don't even know what to talk about without Passover. How are we gonna merge or import Passover into Parshat Tzav? Well, guess what? It's actually really, really easy. It turns out that there's, for all of the difficulty that I have presented to you with, in this case, there's no trouble at all, because Parshat Tzav actually surprisingly has a couple of the most Passover symbols that any Parsha could summon. Okay, and it gets into it pretty quick. So let's take a look at the beginning of Parshat Tzav, and you'll soon see that all of a sudden, in the midst of these arcane priestly rituals, like Passover is right there in your face. Okay, so let's take a look here. I'm gonna put a source sheet into the chat, and then we'll take a look. And we're not gonna read all of this first source, but this is just to show you how the Parsha starts. Here is the word Tzav, which means command. Tzav, command Aaron. And as I said, the sacrifices have been detailed for the first 5 chapters. And now in the 6th chapter, God turns to Moses and say, okay, now you've told all of Israel about the sacrifices, but now tell Aaron and the priestly family how they're going to actually offer the sacrifices. What's the actual procedure? And it starts out talking about the first sacrifice, which is the olah. That's right here, which they often refer to as the burnt offering because it gets all the way burnt up, but it is some animal offering that's given to God. Okay. And we keep going. That's the olah. And you can see the kind of this is why Rabbi Tzadok and I have these Tzav jokes. The priest shall dress in linen raiment with linen breeches next to his body, and he shall take up the ashes to which the fire has reduced the burnt offering on the altar and place them beside the altar, and then he shall take out Okay, so like that's the reading. That's how it looks. But this is the instructions for how the priests are to bring these animal sacrifices. But there were not just there were not only animal sacrifices in the temple, there were grain sacrifices as well. And so the next instruction, or the next kind of like the Torah of the instructions for the next offering, is the Mincha offering. Mincha, which literally means something like a gift, is the grain offering. Oh, I lost it there. The grain offering. Okay. Now, by that I mean you could offer. There are a whole array of sacrifices, and there are sin offerings when you offer a sacrifice because you've committed some transgression, and there are sacrifices for the festivals, like on the holidays you offer particular sacrifices. But there are also just general sacrifices of the olah, the animal sacrifice, and mincha, the grain sacrifice, which people could bring as a voluntary offering to God. Now, we can and should think more about, well, what is the olah exactly? But think of it for now, like that is to say, if the olah is just it gets all the way burnt, what is it actually for? Anyone can bring it? Well, we've done work here in this group before thinking about when exactly an olah is offered. But the point is, there is no specific time. You can bring an olah any regular day of the year, and you're doing it on some level to make an offering to God. So many reasons to make an offering to God and to try and incur divine favor. But if you have animals, you would do that with an olah. But not everybody has animals. And one of the reasons for the grain offering is that it's a cheaper offering. It's something that more people are able to bring. Okay. Now, the mincha offering, the grain offering, is also like the olah offering, is just sort of general. You can offer it at any time. I will point out that the times that we know in the past, and this is a study that this group has done before, if you've been with us for a whole year, the kinds of mincha offerings we've seen in the past is that Cain is the first person to offer a mincha offering, right? And that seems to be Cain has grown some produce and then offers some of it to God. Seems to be a kind of a thanks, or a maybe please keep this produce going. Okay, that's the first mincha offering we know. And the other very prominent mincha offering that we've seen before is when Jacob presents a mincha, an offering, to Esau as a kind of a gift. And it seems again that Esau is more powerful, and Jacob wants to pacify Esau and to curry his favor. Okay, so those are the mincha offerings that we've seen before, but as far as we know now in Leviticus, it's just an offering that anyone can offer, maybe in ways that our ancestors did, but mincha offerings were offered every day, as were olah offerings. Okay, but now let's take a look at the mincha offering, and soon you're going to see Passover pop right up. Okay, this is the Torah of the grain offering, Zot Torah mincha. Aaron's sons shall present it before the Eternal in front of the altar. A handful of the choice flour and the oil of the meal offering shall be taken from it, with all the frankincense that is on the meal offering. And this token portion shall be turned into smoke on the altar as a pleasing odor to the Eternal. So, as is true with many of the sacrifices, you present an offering, some of it is burned on the altar, and then whatever is left over, the priests will eat. So what is left of the flour that you bring, you burn some on the altar, and then what's left shall be eaten by Aaron and his sons, and it shall be eaten as matzot. Ding, 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 ding. Okay, there it is. It shall be eaten as matzot. There it is in the Hebrew. So Aaron and his sons take the remainder of the mincha offering, the grain offering, and they turn it into matzah. Matzah, right? We're thinking a lot about matzah. these days, right? Matzah's, there's no, like, it's not like, oh, like, what does matzah mean? We know what matzah means. We just finished the book of Exodus. Okay. So they eat it as matzah in the holy place. And if that weren't enough, they eat it in the enclosure of the tent of meeting. And if that weren't enough, the Torah reminds us what matzah is and says with these offerings, it shall not be baked with chametz. Lo te'afeh chametz. I have given it as their portion from my offerings by fire. It is the holy of holies, like the sin offering and the guilt offering. Okay? Like the sin offering and the guilt offering, which are holy of holies, but the mincha offering is distinct. I mean, it is a grain offering, so in some ways it's like, it's the obvious place where matzah might pop up, right? Matzah being a grain item, but this is such a glaring reference. This is such a glaring connection, and I let me just make the point absolute before I start opening it up for our interpretation and investigation. It isn't just like matzah was something they ate all the time back then. Okay, it's not like, oh well, yeah, sure, there's lots of crackers around. There are only two contexts in which matzah is eaten, or at least mandated to be eaten in our tradition. Only two. And one is Passover. And the other is the mincha offering. Okay? That's it. So, and it's not just to eat matzah. Make sure that there's no chametz in this. So, our work today, of course, now, is to figure out what is matzah doing in the temple? What is matzah doing there every single day? Why are the priests eating matzah, commanded to eat matzah, when the only context we have for the idea that you might eat matzah is that we ate matzah in haste as we left Egypt, right? Okay. Now, in order to do this work, we're going to have to think a little bit about some of the symbols of matzah and chametz. What are those two words? What are those two substances? What are those two reference points represent? And we'll do that work, but I see hands already going up because, right, I hope you feel, as I feel, like it looked like, gosh, we're in the sort of weeds of the most boring Parsha. And then suddenly it's like Passover's right in front of us. So what is Passover doing here? Okay, I saw Hal and Kathy's hand go up.
Okay, what occurs to me, and I've made this point before in our conversations, is, one of the big themes in the Torah is the sort of competition between a pastoral or nomadic or herding economy and a settled agricultural economy. And it seems to me that one thing that might be going on here is you're putting grain and cultivated crops on the same level as meat or animal sacrifice, as a way of sort of reconciling or leveling the playing field between these two very different forms of society that are still, kind of competing at the time that the Torah is actually written. So anyhow, that's my social, economic, historical take on this. And then
can I add another kind of historical take to it? Is that
always power couple? Go for it.
Yeah, what I think is kind of interesting is that chametz is really associated, I think, specifically with Egypt. There's this great book, Encyclopedia of Jewish Food, and the whole baking of bread and seor, the use of seor, starter. It's not just leavening, but actually starter, and the kind of, it's a specifically Egyptian kind of innovation. And that before that you had much flatter bread. So that I think that it's also, the symbolism has to do with Egypt, really making that distinction from Egypt.
Okay. This is a good. This is one. Thank you to our power couple, Hal and Kathy. This is a wonderful kind of first pass at the question, which is to say, Hal suggests that it's zelo stam, as they say. It's no coincidence that there's a grain offering, and when you see a grain offering follow right after animal sacrifice, which you would think maybe the more likely, right? When we think sacrifice, we think animals sacrificing, killing something for God. God wants meat, whatever. But no, grain is put, Hal suggests, on the same level. But whatever it is, there is a kind of a prominence to the growth agricultural cycle. The Mincha offering must have, as it did for Cain, some relationship to the produce of the ground, right? So when I am offering a mincha offering, I got it from the ground, and I must be saying something about, hey, provide rain. Hey, like I'm a farmer. I'm trying to, like, I want God's, the weather matters for me. I'm in some kind of ancient communication with the forces above. And then Kathy says, right. And if you're doing that kind of thinking and expressing around your agricultural needs and how you are growing and forming produce, so then you want to present the kind of produce, the kind of offering, the kind of product of that offering that is Israel's offering. You're not going to give like Egyptian bread on the altar. And maybe there is some way in which, although here it begins to get a little like a little strange, there's some way in which regular bread is Egypt bread. Like it sort of puts all bread into that category, and that's a big category if you get. But I mean, on the other hand, that does seem to be what this offering is doing. Only ever offer matzah on the altar. So matzah is kind of our bread, right? All right. Great. Thank you to you both. Always glad to have either or both of you in our conversation. Noah, you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, I'm going to tie it a bit into a verse from last week. Adam ki akriv michem karban ladonai, that when a person brings a sacrifice, they bring the sacrifice to God. I learned from Hasidus that we're sacrificing parts of ourselves for that relationship with God. Like Passover time, we're sacrificing all the grain products, all of that, to be more in a much better relationship with God. And as they did it in ancient times, they saw that bread as the Egyptian sort of bread. So taking that bread as the narrowness in our lives, we're sacrificing that to be more open, more ready to accept that wider, more open relationship with God, each other, or whoever else in our lives.
Right. Okay, good. So when we imagine, as Noah is doing, the internal consciousness of the person offering, Adam ki akriv, a person who brings themselves close, who brings an offering, who approaches the temple, what are they thinking? And is it possible that what they're thinking is something that some kind of movement that we learned in the book of Exodus, in the Passover story, a movement from slavery to freedom, a movement from constriction to expansion, a movement from have not to have. And there's something, it's like, surely this person is deliberately tapping into, or the Torah is inviting this person to deliberately tap into that matzah experience. So what does it mean to be in Passover consciousness when you bring an offering? Okay, let me just begin to layer a little bit, and then I'll turn next to Florine, and I see a lot of hands up. But as we begin to discuss what is the symbolism of matzah? Like, what is that, Pat? Okay, there's the whole Passover story, but what is matzah? If matzah is the substance that most symbolizes Passover and the one that we're bringing into our sacrifice, what does matzah mean? Well, I'm not, obviously we could bring libraries full of midrash and commentary on the meaning of matzah, but let's just start with the basics, okay? Because there are some basic symbols. And if I asked you, what are the symbols of matzah? I've learned not to ask questions on Zoom that have like one-word answers, right? Nobody wants to raise their hand for that. But here are some of the one-word answers that you might associate with matzah. First of all, before we even get into the Torah's own symbolism, matzah, the word, is a kind of a visual wordplay, right? Because matzot is spelled the same way as mitzvot. Okay, so that's part of it. Matzah, on some level, is associated with mitzvot, commandments. The Torah uses this word very frequently, but more often it's vowelized to mean mitzvot. Okay, so that's one thing. Then, of course, and I'm jumping to Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy 16 verse 3 gives us a couple of the important symbols in one quick phrasing, and those are one, that matzah is the bread of poverty or the bread of affliction, lechem oni. Okay, so matzah is an impoverished bread or a bread that reminds us of suffering. And then the very next phrase is another important word or symbol that we associate with matzah, which is chipazon, hurriedly. So matzah is the bread of haste. Okay, so those are some symbols that we would very naturally bring to the table when we think, oh, so there's one other context in which we use matzah in the temple. So what is the bread of affliction or the bread of poverty or the bread of haste? Or maybe the word play on mitzvah, what does that have to do with the matzah that we're now seeing here in the Mincha offering? Okay, so that this is just like layers of meaning that we can keep in our minds as we continue analyzing. Florine.
I'm going to piggyback on what Noah just said. To me, leavened bread is a puffed up ego. And so chametz is the residue of that ego. And so, like Noah said, in order to free ourselves and speak up from our soul to God, we must put the ego on the altar and get rid of it.
Great. Okay.
And so that to me is, I mean, it's not expressly mentioned here, but that, to me, that's the understanding. Beautiful,
beautiful. So Florine just filled in the rest of the thought that I was beginning, because I just tried to layer for us the meaning of matzah, but then we can ask, well, okay, so what's the meaning of chametz, of leavened bread, of bread, in other words, right? And Kathy did a little speculating like, oh, it's associated with Egypt, with the abundance of Egypt. But Florine brings us the classic symbolic association with chametz. And for this, we have to turn to rabbinic literature, because the Torah says a lot about what matzah is, or where, what it represents, or at least the Torah says something about it. The Torah never really explains what chametz means or what the problem is, but we do, meaning we, the rabbis, and we, Florine, and we, like, as we look at what matzah means, then we start to say, oh, well, then what's the opposite of that? Abundance, having, wanting, desire, me, like needs, ego, right? And Florine expressed it beautifully. Here is a similar notion expressed in rabbinic language. This is the famous spin on chametz that we get in the Talmud, where Rabbi Alexandri would pray, and then after he prayed, at the end of his prayers, he would say, Ribon ha'olamim, Master of the Universe, Galui v'yadua lefanecha sheritzonenu lasot ritzonecha. It is revealed and known to you, know very well that our will is to do your will. We want to do what you want us to do. We want to. Umi me'akev, but what prevents us from doing your will? Seor shebe'isa. The first answer he gives is the yeast in the dough. That's what keeps us from doing God's will. What? Now, you know, if you're Florine, you can begin to like speculate and wonder, but if you're not getting it, then Rashi's going to help you out. What does that mean? The yeast in the dough? And here you have the kind of the fullness of that rabbinic thought. The yeast in the dough, Rashi says, this is the evil desire in our hearts that leavens us. Yetzer hara levavenu shemachmitzenu. There's that same word, chametz. Machmitzenu. It leavens us. Now, still not exactly sure what that means, but it is, I think it's heading in the direction that Florine was taking us, which is matzah, it represents poverty, constriction, restriction, and so a kind of humility, a kind of willingness to do without, a kind of willingness to let go of oneself and one's self-needs. And chametz then must represent selfishness, ego, desire, the need for stuff, for abundance, for richness, for, right? Okay, so now we've got like one of the most important kind of dyads in the Passover narrative, and a kind of symbolic a binary where on the one hand you have matzah, humility, and on the other hand you have chametz, ego. All right. Okay, so that's a kind of thinking that we can bring to the sacrifices, and Florine started to do that. So let's keep doing that. Yonatan.
The discussion about chametz versus matzah in the temple is actually much larger than just the Minha offering, right? So in general, we're not allowed to bring two things into the temple. It's chametz and honey, right? And I think that Kathy's absolutely right that the simplest origin of that is because that's what the pagan culture we just came from did. And we see that the people in the desert say, I wish we were back in, don't we wish we were back in Egypt where we ate lots of bread, right? So we know that the Torah is aware of this too. And I do think that the symbolism of bread here has a lot to do with like our commitment to elevating material, right? And that has a place. Like we do belong to a religion that elevates material, right? And it celebrates material. That place is not necessarily in the temple. Even the other, you know, the lechem panim, right? The bread of presence was not leavened. But there are two circumstances where we are allowed and in fact commanded to have leavened bread in the temple. There's the offering of Thanksgiving and the offering of the Pentecost, right? So in those cases, we do have kind of this partnership relationship, right? Of God creates the grain and people elevate it. But most of the time in the temple, we're told like, no. It's not your job to start elevating things in the temple. Just do what God tells you. Just be with God, right? The way that God is.
Okay. Okay, so Yonatan is Yonatan's way too smart for me and is already at the end. Yonatan is reminding us. Yonatan doesn't miss a beat, and he's reminding us. Here I am leaning so heavy into matzah. There's matzah in all of the grain offerings. There's matzah. Matzah was this constant substance in the temple. Every time there was a grain offering, the priests ate matzah. Matzah, wow, look at all this matzah and no chametz, right? That seems to be the kind of the glaring message of these opening parshot of Leviticus. But Yonatan is absolutely right that there are two exceptions. There are two exceptions. And I might have asked you to just think about this, like, where do we see bread as an offering, right? If I had asked you, I bet Yonatan and others in this group would have said, wait, bread. Oh, right, don't we bring a bread offering on Shavuot? And that's right. And I want you to now, we'll look at both of the examples that Yonatan mentioned, but let's take them one at a time. I want you to, now that we've established this, these poles of matzah and chametz, and seen how they have come to represent things in our tradition, they've come to symbolize things in our tradition, and that it's usually kind of either chametz or matzah. We sort of see these two symbols now operating as a kind of either or in the sacrifices. So then we can bring that thinking to now look at the offerings much later in Leviticus. I mentioned earlier there are offerings for all of the holidays. Look at the offerings that are described for the Shavuot holiday, and just look how we move from matzah to bread. Okay, so let's just take let's just have a little bit of material that gives fullness to the point that Yonatan was making. Okay, this is Leviticus 23, so much later on, and this is a famous section because we even say this during Kiddush on the holiday. These are the holidays. These are set times of the eternal, the sacred occasions, which you shall celebrate at its appointed time. Now, what's the first one that they mention? Passover, because Passover, according to the Torah, is the first holiday, because Nisan is the first month. And what do they call Passover? Chag HaMatzot, the feast of matzot, and you shall eat matzot for 7 days. Okay, right. Oh, yes, of course. I remember that from the book of Exodus. Okay, so that's Passover. Now let's just look at the movement. After Leviticus is finished telling us about Passover, the Eternal spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land I'm giving you and reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf of your harvest to the priest. He shall elevate the sheaf before the Eternal for acceptance on your behalf. The priest shall elevate it on the day after the Sabbath. On the day that you elevate the sheaf, you shall offer as a burnt offering to the Eternal a lamb of the first year without blemish. The meal offering with it, that's the mincha, shall be 2/10 of a measure of choice flour with oil mixed in, an offering of fire of pleasing odor to the Eternal. I feel like I can't do this. All right, let's skip a little bit forward. Let's skip now to counting 7 weeks. Okay, from Passover you count 7 weeks. You count until the day after the 7th week, 50 days. That's the counting of the Omer, and that takes us up to Shavuot. And then you shall bring an offering of new grain to the Eternal. And what do you bring? You bring from your settlements 2 loaves of bread. 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Each shall be made of 2/10 of a measure of choice flour, baked with chametz as first fruits to the Eternal. Baked with chametz. So there's that language right there. So I know that that's a lot to kind of drag you through all of the particulars of the sacrifices, but the basic point is that once we've got this chametz or matzah thing going on, then the movement of the holidays actually starts to have a new layer to it, where Passover to Shavuot is, of course, Passover is the matzah holiday, but it's not just that. Passover, leaving Passover and moving 7 weeks to Shavuot takes you from matzah to bread. So now what's happening there, right? What is that movement? What's going on now, not just with the mincha offering, but with the Shavuot offering, which is the exception to the mincha offering. This is a bread offering. Okay, let's see, where were we? Let me try to go in order here. I think Richard maybe was next.
Try to unmute. 2 quick points. From historical basis, it seems there was a festival of matzah long before there was a Passover, and somehow the 2 of them got lumped together because the festival of Passover is 1 day. The 7 days, that matzah festival it's an older holiday, maybe reflecting an earlier or even a pagan tradition. That's from my historical readings.
Great, great. Okay, good. So that's important to think about with all of the chagim. It seems like the chagim are agricultural. That seems obvious, right? Like it's the 3 seasons, and they're called at one point the festival of the spring, Chag Aviv, the festival of the reaping, Chag HaKatzir, and the festival of the gathering, Chag HaAsif. That's in the Torah, and that system seems like an agricultural system, and Richard's also right that it seems like that is an earlier system which existed before the Torah starts overlaying its symbols. And the reason that we can say that even within the kind of the logic of the Torah is that when Passover itself is first presented, what we get is you shall now use the holiday of the spring. That will be Chag HaMatzot. Now it's Passover. Now it's associated with your exodus from Egypt. But you have these other 2 holidays that you'll do also. And then later in the Torah, the festival of gathering is then associated with the dwelling in booths as you traveled through the desert, right? So now that holiday is also claimed as a part of the narrative of Exodus. And then this isn't in the Torah, but eventually the rabbis complete the job and say, oh, and Shavuot, that's not just the festival of reaping, the festival of offering new bread. It's also the festival that celebrates our receiving of the Torah, okay? So there's that layering takes place like in real time almost in the Torah. And so that's just important to understand what Richard is pointing us towards. But part of what that must mean then is that there's an earlier logic here at play where the movement from spring to May is a movement from not having grain yet to suddenly having enough to make bread, right? And we've overlaid a movement from slavery into freedom on top of an agricultural system, which is a movement from scarcity in the yearly cycle or beginning in the yearly cycle to growth and abundance, right, in that cycle. So now both these things are happening at once. I saw Matt Silverstein get excited when Richard was talking. So do you want to add to that thought?
That was basically going to be my thinking. What I was going to add to that maybe was that the matzah was in the temple first, and then they took it into the Exodus story to make it, but this is speculation on my part. I knew the facts that he was giving us and just wanted to, so that excitement was sort of a, oh darn. Someone else just said
sure.
it.
I mean, I guess it is worth thinking. I mean, you know me.
I don't know. I mean, that's a I'm just saying I'm speculating. They took this holy thing and they said, let's bring it in there. And now this is gross speculation, and I'm probably no longer standing on air. They're both quick moments. They're both rapid. You don't spend time in the temple and you don't spend time leaving. You're rushing. And I'm saying I'm standing on air because I think that's something I see when it's not existing.
That's interesting. Okay, good. Actually, at the end there, Matt is beginning to do some of the work that I think we haven't yet done and should be doing, which is thinking about, okay, so why are the priests eating matzah? And is there something, Florine actually gave us the first attempt at this and said, well, the priests should be humble. They should be in servitude. And Matt is saying, yeah, and they're in haste. They're working fast, right? The speculation here, and I'll put it out there since Richard and Matt have both surfaced it. Is it possible that matzah isn't just a Passover item, but that like there is a substance out there? Everybody knows there's quick bread when you need to make quick bread, and Passover actually borrows that. That we don't know, but it's an interesting speculation. All right, let me turn to Jen.
I keep getting stuck on the phrase, the bread of affliction. because I think we've talked about poverty and humility, but we haven't really talked about the idea of suffering, or like bitterness, which we were talking about earlier this week. And the idea that you might be bringing to God your suffering, your affliction. Because usually we think about, I offer a sacrifice of joy and thanksgiving, or I offer a petitionary sacrifice, but I can have an intimate moment with God around my suffering and around my affliction is so profound. And the idea that that would be the beginning step during this festival process on the journey to an offering of joy and an offering of abundance, that one is a necessary step to get to the other, I think is just incredibly profound for the way that I would also think about this moment on the calendar.
Incredibly profound. I'm not going to rephrase or repeat that, because you just said it so beautifully, so perfectly. That is certainly another way of thinking about the presence of matzah as an offering. Wendy Becker.
So there's several things I wanted to touch on through what we've been talking about. Going back to what we were talking about, matzah and mitzvah, and going back to what Florine had said, and also Jen, I'm going to get to, but Florine talking about the notion that matzah is all of these things that we're talking about are here in the physical form we're talking about. But our work is to find their significance for us that is much more than the physical. Because we're here on earth, the physical is what we can relate to, and it also deals with our cellular memory. What we eat, what we see, what we feel and smell, that is going to have us learn and remember better than any words or stories. So we have these symbols to remind us of this story that we're asked to go on this journey every year and find significance from it every year, because this journey that we're talking about is not only the journey of our ancestors, I believe, but it's the journey that each one of us is asked to go on. That journey from our own narrowness into freedom. And how do we do that? First, we have to let go of the ego. That's where we need to start. And that the flatness, how we are going then from Pesach, this time where we want to be absolutely without any ego, so that we can see, as we build ourselves again into a place where we can be free to be who we are, learn who we are. That takes steps. And so we have the counting of the Omer, where we go from Pesach to Shavuot, and we rise up, right? We become that from all the aspects each day. We count the Omer, each day we pay attention to various aspects of character, of how we live, what we do. And each day, and it culminates in Shavuot, where we are able to have that place of freedom, of being full and whole, and literally and figuratively, we've risen up to God. And each year we go through this. It's a beautiful thing, a reminder to remind ourselves, and that every year, if we can do this, that we won't be bored with it, because every year we're in a different place in our journey. And every year our journey through our Mitzrayim to our Shavuot, it's different aspects. And we do it ourselves, but it's very important to do it with community.
Okay, great. So that is what Wendy has so artfully distilled for us, sort of synthesized for us, so many of the different pieces of this conversation, but in some ways boils it down to a very kind of a very basic narrative kind of device here, which is just that Passover is always with us. This experience that we had in the book of Exodus, yes, it's in the offerings, because we always have to be tapped into that Passover consciousness. We have to remember where we came from. And Wendy adds, and so that's true with all of the time. And it's true now. And we're always tapping into the Passover story, and we're doing that with matzah. But every year when we move from Passover to Shavuot, by taking ourselves from matzah to bread, we're reliving it. We're re-experiencing the state of affliction and poverty and the movement day by day and week by week to the land of Israel, or to the Torah, or to abundance, right? So
The best we can be, the best of what God has asked us, the best that we can be. That is Torah.
The Passover story is going to stay with us, and of course it's embedded in the sacrifices, in all of the Jewish rituals, because we're going to constantly reliving that experience of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of moving from one state to another, right? So that's great. All right, I have time to just a couple more thoughts here. Let me turn to Joni Brenner.
Thank you. I wanted to know what the rabbinic mind is thinking when we're speaking of slaves and this movement and offering sacrifices around sin, and how much sin could they have committed?
Mm.
And
Well,
I'm sorry. Thank you.
No.
Thank you.
I cut you up. You finish the thought.
I wanted to know, is this a vision for the future? Is this a blueprint way beyond the journey that we're reading about?
Okay.
Thank you.
Joni, say more about that last question. What do you mean by blueprint for the future?
Well, I'm just thinking, how bad could they have been? I mean, there was a bondage, there was slavery, there was leaving in the night. And now I'm reading about offerings that are expected and asked for, and we're speaking about Shavuot. But these are not people, it seems to me, that are strident or have that much. So I'm a little bewildered about so many different.
It's interesting the way you're putting it. First of all, the first response is just everything that we're talking about takes place outside of and apart from the sin offerings. So that's interesting. Sin offerings are different. This is like the Mincha offering, which it's a voluntary offering. It's not incurred by your sin. So it may be that there's something like on the basic daily, everyday kind of the consciousness that we're trying to stay with and drill into our beings. That's where we tap into the history, the Passover story, the sort of like the message that is core to the people. And when it comes to individual, particular kind of relationships with God, there's a different system, a different set of symbols. And then, like this is a system that is meant to endure. And so that suggests that this consciousness that we're trying to, this is much what Wendy was just saying. We're trying to keep it with us eternally. I mean, and that's in some ways, that's the answer to the why is matzah here, because you need to keep matzah around or you will forget about it, right? Now, we have matzah around once a year, but here's a way of keeping matzah in our consciousness at all times, right?
Okay.
I should say, now that we're running out of time and now that Joni is reminding us of the various kinds of sacrifices, that Yonatan is so sharp that he not only suggested the obvious other sacrifice that has bread, the Shavuot sacrifice, the bread offering, but Yonatan reminds us that there's one other exception, one other big exception, and that exception actually happens in the very next chapter of our Parsha, and it is the Thanksgiving offering. Now take a look at this, and I really haven't left enough time for us to process it, but maybe we can do just a little bit here at the end. The Thanksgiving offering is the strangest thing we've seen so far, because here it is. This is the ritual of the sacrifice of well-being that one may offer to the eternal. If he offers it for Thanksgiving, Todah, Im al toda yakrivenu. He shall offer it together with the sacrifice of thanksgiving matzot, with oil mixed in, matzot spread with oil, and cakes of choice flour with oil mixed in, well soaked. This offering with cakes of leavened bread added, he shall offer along with his sacrifice of well-being. Out of this he shall offer one of each kind as a gift to the Eternal. It shall go to the priest who dashes the blood of the offering of well-being. So the thanksgiving offering has both matzot and chametz. And this is totally exceptional, absolutely unusual. A sacrifice that has both matzah and chametz in it. And it's the sacrifice that you offer as an expression of thanks to God. So now here I have only left us a minute to discuss this most puzzling twist in our story. But does anyone have a sense of why that would be? Why Thanksgiving would be the moment that suddenly you merge the two symbols, the symbol of matzah and the symbol of chametz? Yael?
It seems to me these are both of our yitzhars, yitzharot, the world, the earthly intention and the heavenly intention. So this yearly cycle that we're in is such a blessing from God. We can move to beginning again, a spiritual mikvah, that we go through this Yam Suf and we come out, and for our sustenance, we need just earth and water. That's all we need. That's matzah. And that's for our sustenance. And then we get more complicated in the 7 weeks. It's a post-gestational period. Like, I'm thinking that we're like kangaroos. We're born at Pesach, but then we're in this state where we're in our mother's pouch for 7 weeks, and then we're born into the earthly world, and then we become machmitzim. We're complicated, we're complex, we're bonded to heaven and the earth all together. But then as we go back through the yearly cycle, we come to Pesach again, Pasach, and this, the winter has Pasach, the winter has gone over, the death and the shadow has gone over our homes, and we're reborn again.
Mm. So if chametz and matzah represent two kind of sides of ourselves, two kind of polarities of the self, desire and constraint, then what does it mean at the moment of Thanksgiving to be offering them both, to be conscious of both of those parts of ourselves? What is it about thanking God, about giving gratitude, that summons both the chametz, the urge, the desire, and then and also matzah, the constraint, the limitation? Kathy.
I think that we keep talking about this movement, right? Well, the Exodus itself to freedom, the movement of from hametz, from matzah to hametz. But it's also this is sort of fitting in with what other people were talking about, part of this whole cycle of the calendar and the agriculture, which is spring and rebirth and renewal. And so what occurs to me is it's really a very powerful symbol, because if there wasn't that cycle of this continual rebirth and renewal, if it was just all the same, if time was all the same, then the natural thing to do would be to keep your seor, your starter. I mean, in fact, people keep starter going for 100 years or certainly decades, and it's really prized. And so, but this is saying, no, you need to start over again. And I've seen it written that actually this sort of act of faith, that destroying your starter is a big deal. You got it going, it's working, but you get rid of it because you want to start with this kind of clean slate, and that and it fits totally with spring as well as the agricultural cycle. So then what do? You get rid of it because you have faith that you're going to be able to get it back. but it takes you a while. And so I feel like the 7 weeks is like getting your starter back. And so what do? Then you present all of these breads at Shavuot, but that it's not like, you know, one is bad and one's good. I've always had a trouble with that of hametz and matzah, but they're part of this renewal cycle, and it is kind of radical to say, no, you have to start over every year. You can't keep this stuff.
Okay, all right. I think, and I know we're over time, I'll end soon, but I think we've done a masterful job of tracking the movement, that kind of progression from matzah to chametz. And we've seen it now play out in the cycle of weeks between Passover and Shavuot. And we think about it in the exodus from Egypt into the promised land. And there is a kind of like restarting, as Kathleen puts it, where we do that movement every year. But I still don't think that we've gotten to what it is that the state of both at once means to us, okay? The state of both chametz and matzah in the same moment. So I'm gonna take one more try at this. I wanna turn to one last comment. Hannah, do you think you can solve all our problems for us?
Nope,
No.
I think I will solve none of them. And I think I will not answer your question at all, but it's such a great question and I wish I had wisdom, but I don't. But this is just a thing that I've been thinking about, which is where it kind of brings us back to the beginning of class, but why the matzah is the thing that is the offering for the mincha offering. And the mincha offering is a daily offering. Like this is accompanying you all the time, this matzah, this reminder. And I just have been thinking about in our prayer service as it's evolved now in our daily prayer, we say part of the Song of the Sea every day, at least twice a day. We say the Mincha Mocha every day, multiple times. And we also say other parts of the Song of the Sea, but thinking about how has our tradition always evolved to keep us close to that moment of escape and that moment of bondage and of affliction. And we're not carrying matzah around with us anymore, and we don't have sacrifice in the same way, and we don't have offerings in the same way, but we are still tethered deeply to that moment. That's our seminal moment as a people. And it shows up in the physical matzah and what we're looking at in Leviticus. And it also shows up for us every single day in our daily prayer, which is the thing that roots us most closely to the sacrifice that we don't have anymore, but that's where our prayer comes from. And so we're still there. We're still grappling with what does it mean to be both in affliction and in freedom, in slavery and in liberation. And maybe that does a little bit answer your question.
Finally. We got there. No, I mean, I think you're right, because you said both of the things that we're learning. One, that we are tethered to matzah. The matzah experience is the one that we're always going back to. What was that like? We have to keep that with us. We have to remember what it's like to be slaves. We have to remember what it's like to be poor. We have to remember what it's like to not have enough. Always remember that, right? But we're not there anymore. At least hopefully we're not there anymore. So we do have a sense of abundance. And sometimes we negotiate those two states by moving from one to the other. But there are moments where, as Hannah said at the end, we're trying to kind of hold both of those realities. I have a place to live. I have food to eat. I am doing fine, but I still want to know and feel my own sense of limitation and affliction and suffering. I want to tap into that, at least into the history of that, so that I can carry that with me. And there's something, and here we'll have to end because we're way over time, but there's something about holding both of those realities, holding both our desire and our abundance and our joy and our wealth and all of the things that bread represents, right? But keeping matzah in mind, remembering to hold matzah with us. And I will just end by saying that our discussion, though, I don't think it's fully resolved, it tangles off into lots of directions. I do think it's going to help us bring a deeper reading to our Seder in the most classic moment of the Seder, the Manishtana moment, where the first answer to the question, why is this night different from all our other nights, has this very strange formulation, right? Which is that on all other nights we eat chametz umatzah. On all other nights we eat both of them. Why on this night only matzah? And I've always thought, though, that's weird. We don't eat matzah on every other night. We just eat matzah on Passover. But something about that answer is saying most of the time we live with both of these realities, an awareness of the matzah and of the chametz, of the suffering, but also of the joy. Passover is the night where we just stick on, we go deep, deep into the origin of that consciousness, the suffering itself. But most of the time we're holding both of these symbols, right? And there are moments in our calendar year where we do that officially, but actually the truth is, the Haggadah says, every day we have chametz and matzah. We have to live with this polarity and keep it in mind and somehow be able to hold both at the same time. So I wish us all a journey towards chametz, a journey into matzah, into the matzah consciousness, the Passover consciousness that forms who we are as a people, and then may we travel out of that consciousness into the expansiveness of dough rising. Right? Love you all. Wish you a Chag Sameach, Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Thanks for spending 10 extra minutes with me here, those who stayed on. Thanks for all your Torah today. And this whole season, we'll start up again. We won't have next week. We'll start up again in 2 weeks with more Parsha. Bye, everyone.